Welcome, my enthralled dreamers. Tonight's devious tale shall be The Inspired Relic. Lawrence didn't want to go to the funeral. It wasn't that he hated his father, or didn't have any intention of respecting his passing. It wasn't because he was afraid he'd get emotional and weep over the coffin or the mere sight of the lifeless corpse. He simply felt nothing, and didn't wish to waste his time. His father would have understood. He was his father's son, after all. However, Lawrence was required to attend in order to deal with the inheritance of the estate. It sounded fancier than it was. It was simply a decrepit old apartment above a rundown storefront that changed hands every couple of years. Lawrence was the only living relative left, and there was something about letting someone else deal with it that he just didn't like. There was still some sense of duty to handle his father's things properly. It was his legacy, after all, even if it was just a bunch of dusty nonsense. It was his father's nonsense, his family's nonsense, his nonsense. Sorting through the old apartment in the oldest, deepest part of town was quiet, sullen work. It rained all week long. Lawrence didn't mind the busy work, though. It helped him put the creative block out of his mind. It felt nice to accomplish anything at all. Commissions were getting less and less frequent, and he hadn't put out any of his own original work in nearly a year. If he couldn't find his muse again soon, he'd be out of work as an illustrator altogether. Liquidating his father's assets may help him financially, but there would be nothing to mend his pride if his life's work simply dried up and left him an empty husk. He tried not to think about it. He saved his father's office for last. It's where his father would have left the most of himself behind. Bits of his essence trapped in the rambling notes used as bookmarks or plastered across the walls. The degradation of his mind apparent in all the frantic corrections and diagrams scribbled into the margins of his books. Bottles and paraphernalia from spirits and less recognizable sources were tucked into corners or folded sloppily between pages. Sorting through these would prove to be the most draining task of all. Lawrence had found dozens of eccentric odds and ends strewn throughout the small office. Sculptures carved from undefinable material, skeletons of small, unrecognizable creatures, a myriad of dried plants, all found in and out of various containers. As Lawrence had feared, the most difficult part of sorting through this room would be finding the value in its contents. What may have been irreplaceable research to his father was nothing more than the ramblings of a lunatic to the rest of the world. And Lawrence had to choose whether he would side with the world or throw himself into the madness and try to decipher the importance of his father's work. As Lawrence sorted through the office as methodically as he could, he came across something that had caught his interest. It was a small, multifaceted stone, no larger than a ping-pong ball. It felt like it was carved from bone, if bone were capable of being such a color. It was dark and smooth like oil, but when its edges and divots and carvings caught the light, they reflected an eerie, deep, brilliant green. It was the most peculiar thing. The feel of rolling the relic around his hands, the sight of its carvings and shapes and colors, awoke the most surreal thoughts and images to dance and glide dreamily through his head. It was both calming and exhilarating. Lawrence pulled the blank but weathered notebook from his pocket and began to sketch in earnest for the first time in a very long time. The office and its contents could wait. Fantastical terrors swam in Lawrence's head like never before. As skillful an illustrator as he was, his work often lacked an identity, a soul that either reflected himself or the image he was portraying. The swirling cacophony of dreamlike creatures and vistas he had begun to draw since finding the relic had no business being as hauntingly beautiful as they were. Though all his existing commissions fell through, the attention and admiration his new artwork drew more than made up for the loss of clientele. Lawrence had spent his entire career up to that point constantly stressing over his work and his repertoire. It was only after abandoning such trivial obsessions he was free to fill that obsession with something new. The passion that had first drawn him to art in the first place. The haunting beauty of his new creations fueled his ambition like nothing ever had before. After a well-known author had reached out to Lawrence, wondering if he'd be interested in illustrating their newest horror novel, Lawrence began to realize how far he had come, how much happier he was. His art had found its identity, found its soul, and it completed him. Whenever his mind went blank, rolling the dark relic through his fingers brought him the eldritch images he had come to adore so much. Their influence over him and his work only deepened. Lawrence spent the better part of nearly a week familiarizing himself with the manuscript of the novel he would be illustrating, and a few weeks more before that to go through the author's other books. He had refused all other commissions and halted all other projects to properly focus on the book's illustrations. When Lawrence finally sat down to begin his carefully prepared work, however, something was off. The concepts weren't connecting. His interpretations were uninspired. He felt as if what he had drawn was a poor imitation of his own work. He desperately rolled the dark relic around his hand, invoking the life of his swirling terrors, but nothing came. Only a sense of hollow longing tugged at his heart. "This is it then?" the author's publicist asked, their tone soaked in disdain. "Well, I'm still playing around with some ideas, and I have some other ways." "Listen, we don't have time for you to play around. We need your absolute best work for this. That's why we came to you. We need you to have the final prints finished in 2 weeks, and we need the kind of life you brought to your work when we first came to you. Understand?" "I understand. I'll have everything ready by then." Lawrence folded the pitiful pictures back into his portfolio. He had gripped the dark relic tightly the entire time, hoping he would know what to do or say or feel to reassure anyone involved, himself most of all. But all he felt was that hollow pull towards something he couldn't pinpoint. He looked back at a few pieces of his new work deep in the back of his portfolio for reference, some of those first few illustriously horrifying illustrations that had drawn new attention to him. Something wasn't right, though. He didn't recognize any of them. It was like he was looking at all of them for the first time, and as terrifyingly enigmatic as they were, he didn't feel anything either. No inspiration, no fear, no appreciation, no pride in knowing it was supposed to be his work and that it was beloved. On his way back home, Lawrence found himself passing through the older side of town. As soon as he had realized where he was, something inside him longed to return to his father's study, and finally found himself wondering where the relic he had come to cherish so much had actually come from. It had been several months since Lawrence had first come to sort through his father's things during that rainy week, and in spite of all that had changed in his life since then, everything in his father's study remained very much the same as he had left it. He had taken to delving into his father's various notes, hoping to find something, anything that might begin to make sense. Anything that might actually tell him something about what his father had actually done. The hollow void in his heart tugged him through piles of books and notes, until finally coming to a journal of his father's, mentioning not only the dark relic, but where he had found it. It was near a small town, deep in the mountains where he was camping. He found the eerie stone in what he believed were ruins of some kind. His father was no archaeologist, and had no way of properly explaining what he had seen. Still, Lawrence found it odd that any ruins of vague origin near a town, no matter how small, didn't garner some sort of outside attention from anyone. The few details of the ruins that had been noted weren't traceable to any known culture, Any evidence of such ruins were always brushed off as either a hoax or unimportant, just dismissed as nothing more than eclectic graffiti carvings gathered over centuries in a remote place of passing and forgettable interest. Lawrence's father had at least kept the clarity of mind and good senses to name the town and mountain he had gone camping at. Lawrence felt the somber pull tug at his reason. He knew he had to go there and had to search for something, anything that could return his precious, dreamy terrors to him. It didn't take nearly as long as Lawrence had thought it would to arrange a trip to the remote mountainside and make his way to the small village his father had mentioned. Just less than a week left until the deadline. Lawrence was able to glean bits of details from the notes in his father's journal. Apparently, it was an old favorite spot of his grandfather's to go camping. An old family spot that his father had never mentioned to him.
"All right, this is as far as we go. Start setting up camp for the night,"
grunted the old guide who had insisted on escorting Lawrence up the mountain. "But we're nowhere near the top. We haven't found anything at all."
"You want to go any further, you're free to do so in the morning, alone."
"If you live here, why won't you go any further up the mountain?"
"Place is sick, tainted by its own past. Best not to pick the wound if you know what's good for you."
"So why not just leave the mountain?"
"Your finger gets infected. Do you cut the whole arm off?"
Point taken. Still, seems like there might be better options than just staying away and ignoring it if it's as bad as you say.
"Best to just let the land be and heal itself over time."
Lawrence and his guide spent the next few hours setting up a simple camp in a clearing of tall trees, building a respectable fire. As the night came and the fire became their focus, Lawrence never stopped stroking the relic in his pocket. It had lured him toward each choice he had made to get here, tugging lazily at his heart less and less along the way. So, what did happen here to wound the land?
It's best not to talk about it.
Listen, I came up here for a reason. The more you keep hidden from me, the harder it'll be for me to understand all of this. The guide sighed gruffly, chewed on his thoughts a moment or two, and then finally spoke up.
"Crazies. Fanatics. No one ever found out what they were really doing. One day they all finally just up and vanished. Good riddance, says I. Ever since, lots of people claim to see things out here closer you get to the top."
"What kind of things?"
"Most can't really describe them. The more articulate ones say things like spirits, monsters, some even say angels."
"Does anything bad ever happen to these people?"
"The worst thing that ever happens is someone goes up and never comes down, gone without a trace, just like the crazies."
Lawrence gripped the relic tightly and then finally pulled it from his pocket to admire it in the light of the fire. The way the campfire illuminated the shimmering emerald bits of the relic made it appear as if it were breathing, slowly, anxiously, expectantly. "You think this might have anything to do with any of it? Recognize any of the carvings?" Lawrence held the relic out toward the old man. It took a moment or two for his eyes to find the details of the small, multifaceted lump. As soon as he did, the old man knocked it from Lawrence's hand and into the fire.
"The fuck's wrong with you? Where'd you find that thing?"
And the old man shouted, jumping to his feet. And the fire seemed to flare up at the small bit of newly added fuel.
"Me? That was a family heirloom you just threw into the fire, you crazy old shit!" "I knew I shouldn't have brought you up here. You outsiders are always bad luck. Should have just let you come up here alone and vanish."
Before Lawrence could respond back, the fire had begun to sputter and crackle, and both men looked at their surroundings with awe and horror. Ethereal visages of nightmarish creatures and terrifying amalgams swirled around the campfire, skittering and grasping and shifting toward the two men. The old man had cast himself out of the makeshift campsite and into the forest back down the mountain at a surprising pace, leaving Lawrence to bask in the familiarity of the eldritch visions that had abandoned him so callously. He was enamored with their terrifying, dreamy dance converging on him ceremoniously. He felt inspired more than ever before as an otherworldly energy filled his mind. He shook with excitement. The pull within his heart was swelling so much it felt as though it might burst forth from within him. His eyes opened as wide as they could, wanting to drink in all that they could see. And when his mind and heart and body felt like they could handle no more, it all climaxed into a soft, sharp voice resonating into his soul. "Welcome, O Inspired One." Thank you for listening to my tale. I hope it sticks with you for a while. And if you appreciate what I do here, please consider joining my Patreon or checking out my books and art in my online stores. Links down below. And until next time, take care and stay devious.